We are studying the text titled Sri Aurobindo Upanishad, consisting of 19 verses, the first half of which dwelt on the completeness or the vision of completeness of the divine, the Brahman, and in its completeness, he is at the same time transcending, including all that he transcends, including his aspects of being, non-being, all consciousness, all bliss, as well as manifesting himself in all that is time, space, multiplicity, through his power of consciousness. And the whole world is identified with the divine as his manifestation, and it is as real as the divine, although it is the glowing out, the radiation, illumination of himself. But all this, we are taught, is a manifestation of his bliss, and the world itself is world bliss manifesting his bliss. And he himself, as the Lord of bliss, becomes world and world of bliss. He himself chooses to enter this world of bliss as the Jiva, the individualized soul, who is still the all-blissful divine, but now in disguise, descended to enjoy this self-illuminated world of bliss and experience his own bliss in all its aspects, facets, and play. And it is for the play of bliss that the whole world is manifested. But when the soul chooses thus to enter this experience of the play of bliss, he enjoys only bliss because he is himself bliss and the world also is bliss. Yet, he chooses to enjoy the different aspects of the world experience, including that aspect and appearance which we will call the deformation of bliss, or the appearance devoid of bliss. Suffering, weakness, ignorance are also as experiences made up of the play of bliss, and in the play what might be termed as a deformation or a limitation in the play, which appears to us in our surface phenomenal experience as suffering, weakness, and bliss. Behind, seated within, the all-blissful Jiva enjoys only his bliss. He laughs blissfully, cries blissfully. And while the surface being is lost in ignorance, in the sense of separation from his origin, from his completeness, he suffers and experiences finiteness, limitation, incapacity, weakness, and sorrow, and struggles through this form of ignorance in mind. And the root that binds the surface person in this ignorance is ego. Ego is the seed, and once we are delivered from that ego sense of separation, we are also delivered from ignorance, and from that we are delivered therefore from suffering, and the person recovers the blissfulness of the Jiva seated within. Knowing that I am all blissful, he am I am one, I am infinite, I am all. One becomes all blissful, one becomes a being of bliss. And then Sri Aurobindo says, this alone is liberation. When, in the experience of the world of bliss, this liberated being enjoys all experiences, all joys as infinite experiences, infinitely enjoying, but he is not separated from the finites. While he enjoys the finite experiences of the world, he is not reduced from his infinity. He plays with oneness, he plays with multiplicity. He is born as if, although remains always free, unborn, and so on. And all of this culminates in the last two verses which we are now dwelling on. Verse 18 says, "For Leela," that is for this conscious play of bliss, "for Leela indeed is the world. He has become playful for joy. And if it is his purpose to enjoy his bliss, what is our role in that? We being secretly, truly, himself descended as the individualized divine. So for us, therefore, the advice given, and Sri Aurobindo says, therefore be engaged in Leela, O sons of bliss. Being united, play, enjoy the bliss. Having attained the one enjoyable divine enjoyer, enjoy him in all things." This is the exhortation that he gives, places before us. We dwelt on this verse in some detail, and we read also from another text of Sri Aurobindo, where he describes how the blissful experience of the soul within is not yet for humanity. He says that humanity is not yet ready for that, because if that comes up too soon, then the complete experience of drawing out the joy of and the delight of pity and compassion will not have been taken. So there is as if a rhythm of gradual unfolding and awakening in humanity. But Sri Aurobindo distinguishes between the surface experience and the inner blissfulness of the soul, and relates them in this way by saying that joy is the positive distortion of the soul's bliss, and suffering is the negative distortion of the soul's bliss. Both are distortions. Both distortions emerge from the fact that our surface consciousness has been constrained, limited, made finite, cut off from its completeness. And it is by recovering of our wholeness that we experience the same thing now as a facet of bliss. But for this, humanity is not yet ready for this knowledge, and so on. But the yogi, having experienced this truth, automatically discovers an equality of world experience. For him, therefore, whether pleasure of pain, joy or suffering, he is equal to them, because freed from the dualities, he can enjoy the delight behind each of these, of which these are distorted experiences. We saw also another text of Sri Aurobindo where he discusses how we need gradually to awaken ourselves to our own higher ranges of consciousness through the supramental consciousness, culminating in that part of us which lives in the Satchidananda, from which the whole thing originates, even our own individual experience. There is another letter of Sri Aurobindo where he explains a very subtle nuance, and in that letter it is in response to a question from some disciple regarding the experience of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And Sri Aurobindo explains how each of these people who experienced the highest aspects, highest powers or states of consciousness, aspects of the divine, saw that one aspect as predominant. Some said knowledge is greater, others said love and bliss are greater. But Sri Aurobindo explains in that letter that before one can reach the Satchidananda, in normal evolution, one has to pass through the supermind. And in the supermind, all these different facets find their union. Knowledge, power, bliss, or even peace and equality are all united in a single oneness, through which then one recovers the divine bliss, and therefore one sees that highest in all these aspects. It is only when somebody has received that touch of the divine bliss without having based himself in the supramental consciousness that he catches an aspect and says, this is it, this is all, this is highest, this is greater, and so on. This is a very important idea, and particularly in the integral yoga, since we follow the natural progression of evolution, this union of all these aspects is first established before one experiences the Satchidananda, and therefore one experiences it also completely in its totality. Here though, in the text, there is a subtle suggestion pointing to this, where he says in the translation I read, in the English translation, "Therefore be engaged in Leela, O sons of bliss, being united, play, enjoy the bliss." In the Sanskrit, it goes, Anandasya putra, that is children of bliss, yukta, united, kridatanandam bhunktva, enjoy, play in the ananda, the bliss. Ekam bhogyam bhagavantam prapya bhungdvam sarva vastusho. The one enjoyable divine enjoyer having been attained, enjoy in all things him who is the enjoyer and the enjoyment. So, but before that, this yuktva has a double suggestion, united. There is a suggestion that there is something which is still fragmented, separated, which needs to be drawn back into union. And the suggestion here is in the ascent upwards, before we can touch that highest bliss, we must draw together all the different facets, and in that union know the totality and receive the totality of the bliss. The more obvious interpretation of this yuktva is being united together. But even this points to the higher truth, because in the spiritual vision, each person, each human being, or each being or creature even, is a unique facet of the one divine. When we come together and are united, then we as if manifest the totality of the divine in all his aspects and facets. And so, the completeness of the divine manifestation is in the collective manifestation, not merely in an individual realization and manifestation. Therefore, the integral yoga emphasizes the collective dimension of the yoga also. But behind that is this deeper truth that when we come together as a collective body, it is this completeness of the many-facetedness of the divine which is being contained in the collective body. So there is this suggestion behind in the word yuktva that there has to be a union of all these facets in our ascent to the bliss and in our manifestation of the bliss. We now come to the last verse, translated. Unfortunately, the translation is not very good, but I will read what is given first here and then give a more accurate translation. The translator has written, "As commanded by the divine, I shall indeed expound the bliss, Let the bliss manifest itself, removing the obscurity, O sons of bliss. This is a bit of an approximation. When we read the Sanskrit, we find that he articulates it in a very specific way. I shall only expound the bliss, is the Sanskrit phrasing. That means, when we are thus awakened to the true nature of reality as a manifestation of the divine bliss, everything we speak, everything we do can only be a part of that bliss, and a movement, a wave, a ripple, a spray or foam, an expression of that bliss only. There is nothing else except the divine bliss. So I shall only expound the bliss, but the word expound is also not so accurate. In the pravashyami is the word to speak. But you will recall in the Vedic vision and experience, speech is a special power of manifestation. The word, capital W, spoken, is a manifestation into form of a truth which is wordless, of a reality which is held wordlessly and moves into vibration to manifest as the word and the spoken word. So the whole movement of manifestation has been described as a speaking out into vibration. We find this same idea in all of the ancient traditions, including the Chaldean and the Hebrew, which is reflected in the Gospel of St. John, which speaks of the Word which is in the beginning, and the Word itself is God and manifests Him. So there is this idea of the Word as vibration that manifests. So when Sri Aurobindo uses this word, Anandam hi, bliss alone, pravashyami, I will speak up. I will speak. He is not merely speaking of the human speech, but the whole movement of becoming and manifesting. Therefore, we may translate it literally as, we may translate it more completely as, I will manifest only the divine bliss. And then, why? Bhagavad Adishtaha, literally translated as commanded by, as authorized by the divine. But the divine here is Bhagavat, and Bhagavan is the divine enjoyer. So it is the divine blissful enjoyer who has commanded thus, and so I only manifest his bliss. And when we look at it this way, it goes to a very deep truth. The whole movement of our expression in life goes back in its essence to the purpose for which the soul was thrown out from the oneness into the multiplicity for this experience. It all goes back to a movement of bliss in which the divine burst out into multiplicity as if throwing out so many sparks of individualized souls. The origin of our birth as individual souls is the will or the movement of his bliss to manifest. We, therefore, in our essence as psychic beings, are nothing but his blissfulness moving into self-expression, into self-manifestation. So the wording here touches a very deep truth. Bhagavat Adishta, as ordered by, as willed by the divine, is this whole movement of emerging to manifest his bliss. And Anandam hi pravashyami, I will only manifest his bliss as ordained by him. And this touches not only our individual life, but the whole journey of our soul across lives, which is intended only to manifest his bliss. And the next in Sanskrit goes, Tamasam apavritya ananda prakashatam tasya putraha. Tamasam, the darkness, apavritya, removing the covering, removing the envelope of darkness. Ananda prakashatam. Prakasham, remember, is that releasing of light, the glowing out, the radiating of light. But what is it that's being radiated? The bliss is being radiated. So removing the covering of obscurity, radiate the bliss. That would be the literal translation. Prakashatam, it is addressed to the multiplicity of all these children of bliss that we are. And he reminds us, Tasya putraha, of that you are the children. So the bliss of which you are a children, of which you are children, radiate out that bliss, removing the cover of darkness. So the more accurate translation would be removing the obscurity which covers, radiate the bliss, you who are its children. And so there is there are two facets to this verse. One where he says, I will only manifest the bliss. And the second, he says, you as children of bliss should also radiate and manifest this bliss, but removing that covering of obscurity. And what is that covering of obscurity? It is that veil which separates the surface person from the inner divine enjoyer. It is that veil whose removal was described in the verses 15, 16 and 17, where the ego, being the seed, by deliverance from ego one is delivered from ignorance, by deliverance from ignorance one is delivered from suffering, and one recovers the I who is all blissful, and we recover step by step, he am I am one, I am infinite, I am all. One becomes all blissful, one becomes a being of bliss. This alone is liberation. So it is one who has attained to that freedom of bliss who now addresses all of us who are still in the confused state, in the covering of darkness and ignorance. And he tells us, you also, removing this cover of tama, darkness, ignorance, recover that bliss and manifest, radiate the bliss. This wording of radiate, prakashatam, is a resonance of the verse 8 where the whole world was described as a radiance of the divine consciousness and bliss into world of consciousness and bliss from self of consciousness and bliss. And so the movement of the world manifesting was described as this radiation. We ourselves, therefore, participants in this play of world bliss, are meant to continue that movement of radiation. And there is a subtle suggestion, implication here, that we are in our origin the same one who manifested the whole world. Here as individualized beings, when we are liberated, we are consciously the divine enjoyer playing through so many masks. But we continue that movement of radiating and manifesting Him. It is as if each one of us, now united with the Source, becomes a center for a whole world to be born. Sri Aurobindo points to this as the greatest discovery of the Rishis, with the most important implications for the future of humanity. In his commentary on the Upanishad, he says, first they discovered that we are that, and we are identical, each one of us, in our essence as the same self. But the second discovery is the greatest, which has this great implication for the future, that in that one self that we are one with the self of the universe. And why is this so important? Because each one of us, therefore, is the originator of the universe, but also of our universe, which we are meant to manifest each uniquely. So each becomes as if a co-creator in the modern terminology, a co-creator with the divine creator, participants in the divine manifestation and in his bliss. So with this we conclude the text and a glimpse of how profound the message of the text is. There is still the question that remains of a fuller understanding of the nature of bliss and how this bliss manifests in us, through us, and how we are to be liberated into it. And of this we find an elaboration in Sri Aurobindo's commentary on the Veda in the text titled Soma, Lord of Delight and Immortality. In Sri Aurobindo's Secret of the Veda, he takes up several verses to elaborate, to demonstrate his thesis that the Vedas are records of the highest spiritual experiences, but also to then reveal what is hidden in the symbolism of the Veda. And this is a text he takes addressed to the god Soma, where he discusses some of the symbolism but also the process and means by which this bliss is to be received in us, established and manifested. So I thought it worthwhile to complete our study of this text by reading from this, from the New Collected Works. This is on page 354, and I will skip portions, but we will rapidly cover without too much detail, but rapidly cover as a perspective some of the important ideas. So first, the idea here is Soma as the Lord of Bliss is also described as, or the bliss is also described as wine in the double symbolism of the Veda. And so there is the process by which the wine is prepared, which is a symbol of the psychological process by which the secret bliss behind the surface world experience is to be distilled. And so first he gives us this description. It will have great importance in the later part of the text. So I will go through this. Soma is the Lord of the wine of delight, the wine of immortality. Like Agni, he is found in the plants, the growths of earth and in the waters. The Soma wine used in the external sacrifice is the symbol of this wine of delight. It is pressed out by the pressing stone, which has a close symbolic connection with the thunderbolt, the formed electric force of Indra, also called Adri. The Vedic hymns speak of the luminous thunders of this stone as they speak of the light and the sound of Indra's weapon. You see here, straight away this has resonances even in our more superficial understanding. In the body, the sensation is supported by the system of nerves, and the nerves convey the information of sensation with electricity. And so you see how every experience of the world, which is described as the growth of the plants and the waters and the earth, every experience that we have through our senses has to pass through this vehicle which is electric. And so this deep connection is seen even in its most material experience, but it has a deeper relation also in the higher reception of the bliss and the consciousness in which we hold it. But we will see that later. The Vedic hymns speak of the luminous thunders of this stone as they speak of the light and sound of Indra's weapon. Once pressed out as the delight of existence, Soma has to be purified through a strainer. And through the strainer, he streams in his purity into the wine bowl in which he is brought to the sacrifice, or he is kept in jars for Indra's drinking. Or sometimes the symbol of the bowl or the jar is neglected and Soma is simply described as flowing in a river of delight to the seat of the gods, to the home of immortality. That these things are symbols is very clear in most of the hymns. Here, for instance, the physical system of the human being is imaged as the jar of the Soma wine, and the strainer through which it is purified is said to be spread out in the seat of heaven. He uses frequently Sanskrit words to relate to the verses he is commenting on, and I am editing as I read. The important idea here is the human being is the jar, which is meant to receive the Soma and hold him. The hymn begins with an imagery which closely follows the physical facts of the purifying of the wine and its pouring into the jar. The strainer or purifying instrument spreads out in the seat of heaven seems to be the mind enlightened by knowledge. The human system is the jar. The strainer is spread wide for thee, O Master of the soul. Becoming manifest, thou pervadest or goes about the limbs everywhere. So it describes how in this higher enlightened mind of knowledge, now awakened, the Soma is received, and like a strainer it spreads out wide and it is received through the straining threads and strains into the jar, and it pours into us and fills all the limbs of our body. Soma is addressed here as Brahmanaspati, a word sometimes applied to other gods, but usually reserved for Brihaspati, master of the creative word. I remember the text we have just read, where he spoke of the speaking, the manifesting through the word. And Soma is associated with that closely in the Vedic symbol. Brahman in the Veda is the soul or soul consciousness emerging from the secret heart of things, but more often the thought, inspired, creative, full of the secret truth which emerges from that consciousness and becomes thought of the mind. Here, however, it seems to mean the soul itself. Soma, Lord of the Ananda, is the true creator who possesses the soul and brings out of it a divine creation. So this is that whole movement of creation through the individual soul, but still blissful in its origin and led by the movement of bliss always. So for him, the mind and heart enlightened have been formed into a purifying instrument, freed from all narrowness and duality. The consciousness in it has been extended widely. So again we see the connection with the text we read. The cause of our surface limitation is this narrowing, the cutting off in the ego consciousness. And with it, the accompanying division of the world experience of bliss into dualities of positive and negative. So here the human instrument has been freed from all narrowness and duality of consciousness. Having thus been freed, what is this consciousness like? Extended widely to receive the full flow of the sense life and mind life and turn it into pure delight of the true existence, the divine, the immortal Ananda. Now what happens in the human being thus freed? We receive from the whole world, a world of bliss, all these experiences through our senses. So first it is through the sense mind, the sense life, that all of the experience enters us. When thus we have been purified and freed from dualities and narrowness, we receive the whole world as a single embrace of the Lord of delight, meeting us through the senses. And it is as if through all the senses there is this movement again of straining and purifying, but the full flow now reaches us, and entering it turns into pure delight of the true existence, the divine, the immortal Ananda. So received, sifted, strained, the Soma wine of life turned into Ananda comes pouring into all the members of the human system as into a wine jar, and flows through all of them completely in their every part. As the body of a man becomes full of the touch and exaltation of strong wine, so all the physical system becomes full of the touch and exaltation of this divine Ananda. So the analogy is as when we have drunk even of the physical wine, it seems as if to penetrate all the parts of the body and brings a kind of an exaltation. Here it is the divine wine of delight which similarly penetrates and brings an exaltation, but of a very different kind. It is an exaltation of the divine Ananda. And here a very interesting distinction comes, which corresponds to the character of that experience. So we will read a little bit of this technical distinction. He uses two terms, Prabhu and Vibhu, in the Veda, and he discusses what they mean. Vibhu means becoming or becoming into existence pervasively. Prabhu is becoming, coming into existence in front of the consciousness at a particular point as a particular object or experience. And this describes two different ways in which the divine bliss fills us. So he says, Soma comes out like the wine dropping from the strainer and then pervading the jar. It comes into the consciousness concentrated at some point, Prabhu, or as some particular experience, and then pervades the whole being as Ananda, Vibhu. And this is the experience we have always in our contact with the Divine Presence, whether it takes place in a more exterior consciousness or in an interiorized meditative state. In the contact with the Divine Consciousness, there is a particular experience which first touches us. We feel it intensely in that aspect, that quality, that form or that presence or that part of us. But immediately you notice, it is from that touch as if some deep peace or delight or presence spreads to fill the whole being. So this is that double part of the experience. And the Veda actually describes them. Now comes the requirement. The next paragraph, he discusses the difficulty of the human system to hold. But it is not every human system that can hold, sustain and enjoy the potent and often violent ecstasy of that divine delight. He who is raw and his body not heated does not taste or enjoy that. He translates from the Veda. Atapta tanu, the unbaked body, unbaked jar, which breaks when it receives the soma in the Vedic imagery. He again translates, only those who have been baked in the fire bear and entirely enjoy that. So the fire here, the heat here is the tapas with which the whole system has to be prepared and purified. The wine of the divine life poured into the system is a strong, overflooding and violent ecstasy. It cannot be held in the system unprepared for it by strong endurance of the utmost fires of life and suffering and experience. The raw earthen vessel not baked to consistency in the fire of the kiln cannot hold the soma wine. So this is what happens in the human being if it is not prepared, and this divine delight pours into us. We are as if the unbaked mud, it cannot bear. It breaks and spills the precious liquid. So the physical system of the man who drinks this strong wine of Ananda must, by suffering and conquering all the torturing heats of life, have been prepared for the secret and fiery heats of the soma. Otherwise, his conscious being will not be able to hold it. It will spill and lose it as soon as, or even before it is tasted, or it will break down mentally and physically under the touch. So it is a common experience, unfortunately, when the unprepared mind or life energies or body are brought too soon in contact with the intensity of the divine consciousness, there is sometimes a breakdown. Sometimes even before it can have the touch of the experience, the reaction begins. You will remember several incidents of this kind even here. Sri Aurobindo once half joked that wherever there is an ashram for yoga, you need to have a mental asylum nearby for people who lose their balance. But here you remember the incident where Sri Aurobindo tried to give the experience of silent mind to a few people, and he said that after a while they couldn't contain it, they thought they were going mad and they had to leave. He gives another example of a person who, I forget his name now, but it is he mentions the name in one of his letters. He was here in the ashram for a few years and then he had to leave. And Sri Aurobindo explained that he was one in whom the mind had not yet developed. He was still living more in his emotional being, and even that was too narrow. And under the pressure of the sadhana, it began to become unstable. And he began to have fantasies of greatness and things like that. And so Sri Aurobindo had to ask him to go. We also recall the most dramatic such experience when, on the first anniversary of the supramental manifestation in 1960, 29th of February, the mother had given explicit instructions that when people came to receive blessings from her, they should not touch her, and she would merely give the message from her hand into their hand without allowing a contact of her with her body. And that was a clear enough instruction. But one man was foolish enough that when mother gave him the card, he tried to reach out and touch her hand, and instantly he was thrown back as if by an electric shock and fell down unconscious. And mother had to diminish the intensity of what she had brought down just to make it bearable. Sri Aurobindo similarly, when he was asked to bring one more darshan between the February and the August darshans, someone complained we have had too big a gap. Sri Aurobindo says, every time that I have to prepare for the darshan, I have to reduce the intensity of the power to make it bearable for people. And it slows down the work that I am doing. And one has to understand what that means, that most people felt so overwhelmed in the darshan, but that was already with the reduced power. And for many, the experience as they have described, with that one brief darshan, even without the physical contact, just standing in front of Sri Aurobindo and the mother, there are examples of people who came back and then they were in a state of stupor for 3 days. They didn't know what they were doing. Externally, the body was going on in its routine, but they were in a completely different state, and it took them several days from that state to come back to some sense of normalcy. But things like that are an indication of how incapable the human system is in its raw state. So even before even the experience is had, it can begin to break down. I can share an interesting experience as an aside. On some occasion, I had the privilege of going to the mother's room because I was working upstairs to help clean things. And I came out of that brief entry, brief contact, with a certain intensity. And I was myself not fully conscious that the body was breathing quite heavily and rapidly. So Kumud Ben was there as mother's attendant, and she noticed that, and she said, "Is it too intense?" I was not conscious because I was in a totally different state. But I noticed at that point that the body was going, heaving and breathing a little fast. So she said, "Mother said that if it is too intense, then you can touch water." And there was nearby the bucket in which the water, the dirty water was there from the wiping of the floor. And she said, "Touch with your fingertips here." And as soon as I touched the water, instantly I felt the whole thing drain away, and I was back to my so-called normal state. And I said, "What a pity, what a foolish thing I did." But there were two things which were important to notice as a lesson. One was that it is so easy for the physical system to get overwhelmed, even if some other part, maybe the mental consciousness, is able to receive and hold something. But the body needs to be prepared and trained. Its consciousness needs to be widened and purified. The second was that this thing which was causing this whole experience was not me. It was something which was filling in me as a vessel is filled by liquid. And it could just as well be poured or spilt out instantly sometimes. So the imagery here is a very precise description that there is something that fills this jar of the human system, and it can easily be spilt or one can lose it, even before it is tasted. This strong and fiery wine has to be purified, and the strainer for its purifying has been spread out wide to receive it in the seat of heaven. Its threads or fibers are all of pure light and stand out like rays. He is quoting each time the text in Sanskrit which I am editing out. Through these fibers, the wine has to come streaming. The image evidently refers to the purified mental and emotional consciousness, the conscious heart, Chetas, whose thoughts and emotions are the threads or fibers. Dyaus or heaven is the pure mental principle not subjected to the reactions of the nerves and the body. In the seat of heaven, the pure mental being, as distinguished from the vital and physical consciousness, the thoughts and emotions become pure rays of true perception and happy psychical vibration, instead of the troubled and obscured mental, emotional, and sensational reactions that we now possess. Instead of being contracted and quivering things, defending themselves from pain and excess of the shocks of experience, they stand out free, strong, and bright, happily extended to receive and turn into divine ecstasy all possible contacts of universal existence. Therefore it is Divas Pade, in the seat of heaven, that the Soma strainer is spread out to receive the Soma. Now this is a very interesting description. Practically it means that the biggest difficulty we have is in the part of the life energy, the emotional life energies, and the physical consciousness. But the mind can be more quickly freed and widened, purified enough that it can receive. All sense experience finally registers in the mind, but it must pass through the physical and vital systems. So often when we have a strong or intense contact, It is the physical and vital system which feels disturbed and agitated, but the mind can easily receive and hold. You will remember an experience of Sri Aurobindo that he describes in poetry, where the sting of a scorpion was experienced by him as the touch of the beloved of Sri Krishna. Now, this kind of experience is possible when the physical and vital consciousness has been sufficiently purified. Otherwise, to the body it would be intense, agonizing pain. Although to the liberated consciousness, whether in the soul within or even including the liberated mind, there would be the perception of the divine touch. The body might start trembling or shaking by the intensity of that contact or the pain. So it is only when the vital and physical natures are purified sufficiently that one can have the full capacity to hold. Thus received and purified, these keen and violent juices, these swift and intoxicating powers of the wine, no longer disturb the mind or hurt the body, are no longer spilt and lost, but foster and increase mind and body of their purifier, so increasing him in all delight of his mental, emotional, sensational and physical being, they rise with him through the purified and blissful heart to the highest level or surface of heaven, that is, to the luminous world of Swar, where the mind capable of intuition, inspiration, revelation is bathed in the splendors of the truth, Ritam, liberated into the infinity of the vast, Brihat. These are all terms used to describe the supermind. But the idea here is, in this way, when the divine presence and its power and delight are held and contained in the system, it has the transforming effect of raising the whole consciousness and developing and establishing the ranges of intuition, inspiration, revelation upwards towards the supermind. So far, the Rishi has spoken of Soma in his impersonal manifestation. We have been seeing it as a liquid, a presence, a force, a delight that pours, but it is impersonal. As the ananda or delight of divine existence in the human being's conscious experience. He now turns, as is the habit of the Vedic Rishis, from the divine manifestation to the divine person. And at once, Soma appears as the supreme personality, the high and universal Deva. In the integral yoga, we make use of both of these facets. The divine as the impersonal presence or consciousness, or the divine as this formed being and person as the divine mother or the divine Lord, the Supreme Lord himself. The Supreme Dappled One, he makes the dawns to shine. He, the bull, bears the worlds seeking the plenitude. And he describes how the language, I'll skip a little bit of this, how he moves to manifest, and the symbol of the bull and the cow in the Veda are described. So I'm skipping some of that. The dappled bull is the Deva in the variety of his manifestation, many-hued. Soma is that first supreme dappled bull, generator of the worlds of the becoming. For from the Ananda, from the all-blissful one, they all proceed. Delight is the parent of the variety of existences. So you see here, even the creation of the world originates from this Ananda, from this Soma as the Lord. He is the bull, Ukshan, a word which, like its synonym Vrishan, means diffusing, generating, impregnating, the father of abundance, the bull, the male. It is he who fertilizes force of consciousness, nature, the cow, and produces and bears in his stream of abundance the worlds. He makes the dawns shine out, the dawns of illumination, mothers of the radiant herds of the sun. And you see here again the deep resonance with the text we've been studying, where the world is described as this radiation of consciousness and bliss. And he seeks the plenitude, that is to say, the fullness of being, force, consciousness, the plenty of the Godhead, which is the condition of the divine delight. So unless you have the fullness, you cannot receive the delight. In other words, it is the Lord of the Ananda who gives us the splendors of the truth and the plenitudes of the vast by which we attain to immortality. There is a paragraph where he discusses the role of the Rishis, who are described as the fathers who discovered the way of the Vedic mystics, and are supposed to be still spiritually present, presiding over the destinies of the race, and like the gods working in man for his attainment to immortality. But I skipped that portion, and now comes that part of the establishment and the transformation in us that the Ananda brings about. The birth of the gods is a common phrase in the Veda, by which is meant the manifestation of the divine principles in the cosmos, and especially the formation of the Godhead in its manifold forms in the human being. So the birth of the gods not only is the movement in which things by the powers of the divine are brought about and manifested in the world, but much more in us individually, the gods take birth and manifest. So in the last verse, the Rishi spoke of the Deva as the divine child preparing for birth, involved in the world, in the human consciousness. And this reminds us of the psychic being. Here he speaks of him as the transcendent guarding the world of the Ananda, formed in man, and the forms of the Godhead born in him by the divine knowledge, against the attacks of the enemies, the powers of division, the powers of undelight, against the undivine hosts with their formations of a dark and false creative knowledge, avidya, illusion. So here within us there is this divine presence which guards against these distorting forces. So there is the aspect of protection that the Ananda brings, by which when the Ananda governs us, we are protected from the distortions and we no longer stumble, we are freed from the crooked ways, we walk straight and become entirely perfect in the works and can spontaneously manifest the truth. So this description I skip and come to the last part. Soma manifests here as the offering, the divine food, the wine of delight and immortality, and as the Deva, Lord of that divine offering, above as the vast and divine seat, and the superconscient bliss and truth from which the wine descends to us. As the wine of delight, he flows about and enters into this great march of the sacrifice, which is the progress of man from the physical to the superconscient. He enters into it and encompasses it, wearing the cloud of the heavenly ether, the mental principle, as his robe and veil. The divine delight comes to us wearing the luminous cloudy veil of the forms of mental experience. In that march or sacrificial ascent, the all-blissful Deva becomes the king of all our activities, master of our divinized nature and its energies, and with the enlightened conscious heart as his chariot, ascends into the plenitude of the infinite and immortal state. And here we find the description of the psychic being as the true Lord, the King, the master of our nature and its energies, with the enlightened conscious heart as his chariot. And you see here how the establishment of the Soma as the person is in the psychic seat, and it is from there that his manifestation flows through the human personality. In the practice of the integral yoga, we may view this aspect of the divine Soma as the Lord in his individual personal form as a power and an aspect of the Divine Mother herself. And we speak here rather of the Divine Mother who descends, takes her seat in our heart, and establishes her presence in the psychic seat, and from there rules our nature and works to purify and transform our whole being. But you see, the principle is the same, and its elaboration is provided in this commentary on Soma, of which the result is described in the text we have just read. As commanded or inspired by the divine, I shall only expound the bliss, removing obscurity, radiate the bliss, you who are its children. In the earlier verse, for Leela indeed is the world, he has become playful for joy. Therefore be engaged in Leela, O sons of bliss, being united, play, enjoy the bliss. Having attained the one enjoyable, blissful divine, enjoy him in all things. We will conclude this text next time with a quick survey of all 19 verses so that we may hold in our consciousness the sense of completeness of the whole text. But with this we complete the detailed study. Anandam hi pravashyami, Anandam hi pravakshami, Bhagavat adishtah, Tamasam apavritya, Ananda prakashatam tasya putraha.